War has always been a shadow walking beside humanity. Since the first tribes clashed over land and water, the world has been shaped by battles, and battles have always been shaped by leaders. Not every warrior becomes a legend. Some fall, forgotten in the dust. But a few rise above the chaos, guiding men through fire and steel, carving their names into eternity. They are remembered not because they fought, but because they led. They commanded not just with swords, but with minds sharper than any blade. And when history tells their stories, it tells us how one leader can change the destiny of millions. Close your eyes and imagine the roar of thousands of soldiers marching as one, the earth, trembling beneath their boots, the sound of trumpets echoing across the field's banners, flying high, and at the very front a single figure, calm, fearless, eyes burning with vision. That is the image of a true military leader, and that is where our journey begins. More than 2,000 years ago, when the world was divided into kingdoms and empires, a boy in Macedonia dreamed of something no one dared to imagine. His name was Alexander. At just 20 years old, he inherited the throne after his father's assassination, and in less than a decade, he turned that throne into the foundation of the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. They called him Alexander the Great, and to this day, his name carries the weight of unstoppable conquest. Alexander was not a brute who won with sheer force. He was an artist of war, painting victory with tactics that stunned even his enemies. His most famous creation was the Macedonian phalanx, rows of disciplined soldiers carrying long spears that locked together like a wall of death. With it, Alexander crushed armies much larger than his own. But more than his formations, it was his mind that won battles. He knew when to strike, when to wait, and when to risk everything. Take the Battle of Gaugamela. The Persian king Darius stood with more than 200,000 men. Alexander had less than half that number. By every rule of war, he should have lost. But Alexander refused to follow rules. As the Persians tried to surround his army, he created a gap, lured them in, and then drove his cavalry straight at the heart of their king. The Persians panicked, Darius fled, and the empire of Persia crumbled. Alexander became a legend that day. He was not just winning wars, he was shaping civilizations. Wherever he went, from Egypt to India, he spread ideas, culture, and the dream of uniting the world under one banner. He died young, just 32, but in that short life, he never lost a single battle. Imagine that, thousands of years of war, and still, few can claim such perfection. But Alexander was only the beginning. Rome was rising, and with it came another genius of command, Julius Caesar. Unlike Alexander, Caesar was not born into a throne. He built his power with words, alliances, and brilliant strategy. He understood that war was not just fought with swords but with politics, propaganda, and the loyalty of men. When he marched into Gaul, modern-day France, he faced fierce tribes who fought with the strength of the land. Yet Caesar studied them, divided them, and conquered them one by one. His writings about these campaigns became famous, but behind the words was a man who knew how to win soldiers' hearts. His men loved him, not just because he led them to victory, but because he shared their hardships. He marched beside them, ate with them, bled with them. When storms froze the land, Caesar was there. When hunger struck, he starved with them. That bond made his army unstoppable. The Battle of Alesia is remembered as one of Caesar's greatest triumphs. Surrounded by a massive Gallic force, most commanders would have retreated, not Caesar. He built 2 walls, one to keep the enemy trapped inside, and one to defend against reinforcements outside. Trapped between hunger and hopelessness, the Gauls surrendered. It was not just a victory, it was a statement. Rome was destined to rule, but Caesar's brilliance was also his downfall. His power terrified the Roman Senate, and when he crossed the Rubicon River, he declared war not just on his enemies, but on the Republic itself. His boldness changed Rome forever, turning it from a democracy into an empire. And though his life ended with daggers in the Senate chamber, his name lives on as a symbol of leadership, strategy, and ambition without limits. Yet even Rome, powerful as it was, found itself shaken by a man who came from Carthage. His name was Hannibal Barca, and his story is one of audacity unmatched. While most generals dreamed of fighting Rome in Italy, Hannibal did the impossible. He actually brought the war to Rome's doorstep, and he did it by crossing the Alps with war elephants. Think of it, snow-covered mountains, freezing winds, and an army dragging giant elephants across cliffs. Thousands died, but Hannibal pushed through, and when he descended into Italy, Rome trembled. At the Battle of Cannae, he faced an army twice his size. Most would have crumbled, but Hannibal executed one of the greatest tactical maneuvers in history. He let his center weaken, drawing the Romans in, while his cavalry and infantry encircled them completely. In hours, nearly 50,000 Romans were slaughtered. It was a massacre that shocked the world. For years, Hannibal roamed Italy, defeating army after army. Rome could not catch him, yet Carthage failed to support him fully, and eventually Rome struck back in Africa, forcing Hannibal to return. At Zama, he was finally defeated, but even then, his genius was unquestioned. Hannibal taught Rome fear, and his tactics are still studied in military academies today. He proved that sometimes courage and cunning can shake even the strongest empire. History moved forward, and with it came new leaders, new wars, new dreams of conquest. But what united Alexander, Caesar, and Hannibal was not just their victories, it was the way they led men. They were not faceless rulers sending soldiers to die. They were visionaries who stood at the front, who inspired belief so strong that armies followed them through deserts, across mountains, into the jaws of death itself. Every era produces warriors, but only a few become legends. And as we step deeper into history, we will meet more of them. Men who carried faith as their sword, men who rode with fire in their eyes, men who united tribes and built empires out of dust. The ancient world gave us Alexander, Caesar, and Hannibal. The next age will give us warriors who became known as the sword of God, as liberators, as conquerors feared across continents. Their stories are coming, and when you hear them, you will understand why leadership is not just about war, but about destiny. The ancient world had given birth to conquerors who shook empires, but history was not finished creating warriors of destiny. As the centuries turned, new fires rose in deserts, in castles, and across endless steppes. This was the age when faith, loyalty, and sheer will created leaders who did not just win battles, they forged legends that echoed through every corner of the world. It was in the scorching heat of Arabia that one of the most extraordinary commanders in history appeared. His name was Khalid ibn al-Walid. To his enemies, he was a storm that could not be stopped. To his people, he was the sword of God. Khalid's genius lay not just in his speed, but in his ability to adapt. He was a master of maneuver warfare, turning weakness into strength. When the powerful Persian Empire and the mighty Byzantine forces threatened the young Muslim community, Khalid stood at the front. At the Battle of Yarmouk, his brilliance decided the fate of the Middle East. The Byzantines had numbers, resources, and allies. Khalid had discipline, courage, and a mind that saw war like a chessboard. For 6 days the armies clashed, dust rising, swords flashing. Khalid maneuvered his cavalry with such precision that the Byzantines found themselves trapped, crushed between walls of steel. The once unstoppable Byzantine army broke and fled. With that victory, the doors of Syria opened, and a new chapter in history began. Khalid ibn al-Walid never lost a single battle. Imagine that, dozens of campaigns across deserts and empires, and not once did defeat touch him. His very name became a weapon, striking terror before swords were even drawn. But Khalid was not alone in shaping history's tide. Another name rose from the sands, a man remembered not just for war but for honor. Salahuddin Ayyubi, known in the West as Saladin, became the symbol of chivalry and leadership. At a time when crusaders had carved kingdoms in the heart of the Muslim world, Saladin emerged as the unifier, bringing fractured lands together under one banner. Saladin's greatness was not only in his victories but in his character. When he recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, the world expected bloodshed, for the Crusaders had slaughtered thousands when they first took the city. But Saladin showed mercy. He allowed Christians to leave peacefully, sparing women, children, and the weak. This act of compassion stunned even his enemies. Yet on the battlefield, he was relentless. At the Battle of Hattin, he faced the Crusader kings under the blazing sun. His forces cut off their access to water, exhausting them, breaking their spirit. When the moment was right, Saladin struck, surrounding them, crushing their armies, and capturing their king. The Crusader dream shattered in the desert dust. To this day, his name carries respect across cultures, proof that greatness in war is not just about conquest but about humanity. But while Saladin was reclaiming lands in the Middle East, far away on the endless steppes of Mongolia, a storm like no other was brewing. His name was Temujin, but the world remembers him as Genghis Khan. Few figures in history inspire as much awe and fear as this man. Born into hardship, abandoned by allies, hunted by enemies, Temujin rose from nothing. With iron will, he united the Mongol tribes, forging the most fearsome war machine the world had ever seen. Genghis Khan changed the very nature of warfare. His armies were fast, disciplined, and merciless. The Mongol horse archers could strike, vanish, and strike again before enemies even realized what was happening. But it was not just speed, it was strategy. Genghis used spies, deception, and psychological warfare. He would pretend to retreat, luring armies into traps, then surround and annihilate them. He spread terror deliberately, knowing fear could break a city before a single arrow was fired. Under his command, the Mongol Empire stretched from China to Europe, the largest land empire in history. Cities crumbled, kingdoms fell, and maps were redrawn. Yet behind the destruction was also creation. Genghis established laws, promoted trade along the Silk Road, and built a system that connected East and West in ways never seen before. To his enemies, he was a monster. To his people, he was the father of a nation. Love him or hate him, one cannot deny that Genghis Khan was one of the greatest military leaders the world has ever known. From Genghis came a line of conquerors, and one of them was Timur. Like his ancestor, he struck with ferocity and brilliance. His campaigns across Central Asia, Persia, and India left cities trembling. At the Battle of Ankara, he defeated the mighty Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, capturing him in chains. Timur was ruthless, his wars leaving rivers of blood, yet his empire left behind monuments, art, and architecture that still stand today. He was a paradox, a destroyer and a builder, a man who used fear as his weapon and left his mark on every land he touched. As centuries rolled on, the art of war kept evolving, and so did the leaders who mastered it. In Europe, knights in armor clashed for crowns, castles rose and fell, and generals with iron fists carved their names into history. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, stood as one of the most formidable crusader warriors, respected even by Saladin himself. His courage on the battlefield became legendary, though his ambition often brought suffering to his people. And in France, another warrior queen arose, Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed visions from God and led armies against the English during the 100 Years' War. At just 17, she transformed despair into hope, inspiring soldiers with faith and fire. Though she was captured and burned, her legacy lived on, and centuries later she was remembered not as a victim but as a saint and a symbol of unbreakable will. The medieval era was an age where war was as common as breath. Castles, crusades, invasions, and rebellions filled the chronicles of every kingdom. But through the chaos, leaders emerged who understood what it meant to inspire men, to take them into the jaws of death, and bring them out victorious. Khalid ibn Owald, the sword of God, never knowing defeat. Saladin, the merciful conqueror, who proved that humanity could shine even in war. Genghis Khan, the storm from the steppes, who reshaped the world through fire and fear. And Joan of Arc, the unlikely warrior who proved that even the smallest voice could command an army when fueled by belief. The medieval world gave us these names, and many more, but as time moved forward, war itself began to change. Gunpowder roared, cannons thundered, ships carried armies across oceans, and empires stretched beyond continents. A new age was dawning. It would give us men like Napoleon, who rewrote the book of war, and admirals who ruled the seas as kings ruled land. The battlefield was evolving, but the essence of leadership remained the same: courage, vision, and the ability to command not just armies, but destiny itself. The medieval world had been forged by swords and horsemen, but as centuries passed, a new sound echoed across battlefields. The roar of cannons. Gunpowder had changed everything. Fortresses that once seemed unbreakable crumbled under fire. Ships armed with cannons carried wars across oceans. And in this age of fire and steel, a new kind of leader was born. Commanders who combined genius with ambition, who built empires not just on land but on sea, who saw war not as chaos but as a science. Among them stood one man whose name is spoken with awe and fear even today: Napoleon Bonaparte. Rising from obscurity in Corsica, he climbed the ranks of the French army during the chaos of revolution. He was not born into royalty, not destined by birth to command, but by sheer brilliance and unshakable will, he became Emperor of France. Napoleon changed the face of warfare forever. His soldiers marched faster, fought harder, and believed in him as though he were destiny itself. Napoleon's genius lay in his speed and his ability to concentrate power at the right place at the right time. While his enemies moved slowly, weighed down by tradition, Napoleon struck like lightning. At Austerlitz, one of his most famous victories, he faced a combined army of Russians and Austrians. Outnumbered, he pretended to be weak, luring them into a trap. Then, at the perfect moment, he unleashed his forces with devastating precision. In one day, the fate of Europe changed, and Napoleon stood unchallenged as a master of strategy. He won again and again, defeating coalitions of nations determined to destroy him. His soldiers called him the Little Corporal, not in mockery, but in love, because he had once been one of them. And he never forgot it. He shared their marches, their cold nights, their hunger, their victories, yet his ambition knew no bounds. He wanted not just France but Europe itself. For years he ruled as a conqueror, until the snows of Russia swallowed his army and the combined might of Europe finally broke him at Waterloo. But even in defeat, Napoleon left behind a legacy. His campaigns are still studied in every military academy. His name is written beside Alexander and Caesar as one of the greatest commanders of all time. But while Napoleon ruled the land, another kind of leader commanded the seas. Admiral Horatio Nelson of Britain was the very embodiment of naval genius. His life was a tale of courage, loss, and brilliance. Even after losing an eye and later an arm in battle, he continued to fight. To Nelson, the sea was not just water, it was a battlefield he could bend to his will. At the Battle of the Nile, he shattered the French fleet, cutting Napoleon's ambitions in Egypt to pieces. But his greatest triumph came at Trafalgar in 1805. Facing the combined fleets of France and Spain, Nelson knew Britain's very survival was at stake. Outnumbered, he abandoned tradition, ordering his ships to sail straight into the enemy line. Chaos erupted, but chaos was Nelson's ally. His ships broke the enemy apart, delivering a crushing victory that secured British dominance of the seas for a century. Nelson himself fell that day, struck by a sniper's bullet, but his last words were of victory. His death sealed his legend, and Britain's empire rose on the foundation of his triumph. Across the seas and in the heart of Europe, another empire was flourishing: the Ottomans. At its peak, under the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents. Suleiman was not just a sultan, he was a warrior king, leading his armies personally into battle. His reign saw great sieges, like the capture of Belgrade and Rhodes, and the near conquest of Vienna. Under his command, the Ottomans became a superpower, feared and respected across the world. But Suleiman was more than a conqueror. He was also a builder of laws, a patron of the arts, a leader whose empire blended might with culture. His soldiers followed him because he gave them not only victory, but vision. Beyond Europe, empires were also rising in the East. In India, the Mughal emperors commanded vast armies and built monumental legacies. Leaders like Akbar the Great expanded their empire through a mix of war and diplomacy. He united diverse peoples, blending cultures, and building a realm that thrived for centuries. His strategies were not always about the battlefield. Sometimes leadership was about knowing when to fight and when to build. But not all leaders of this era commanded from thrones. Some rose from rebellion, from resistance, from the desperate will of their people. In South America, Simón Bolívar became the liberator. Inspired by dreams of freedom, he led campaigns against Spanish rule across vast lands, enduring hardship and betrayal, yet never surrendering. Bolívar's marches through the Andes, crossing mountains higher than the Alps, became legendary. With a vision of a united South America, he defeated empire with determination and strategy. Though his dream of unity fell apart, he remains the father of nations, a symbol of how leadership can inspire entire continents. This was also the age of exploration and colonization, when European powers clashed for dominance not only in Europe but across the world. Armies and navies stretched thin across oceans. Commanders had to fight in unfamiliar lands, facing not just enemies but the fury of nature itself. Leadership in this era was no longer about leading a single army. It was about commanding empires, balancing wars on multiple fronts, and shaping the fate of nations thousands of miles away. In this shifting world, the art of strategy evolved. War was now about logistics, about moving supplies, managing resources, keeping armies fed, and maintaining morale across endless campaigns. Leaders who mastered this, like Frederick the Great of Prussia, became legendary. He fought against larger coalitions and yet survived, thanks to discipline, speed, and innovation. His tactics turned Prussia into a power that would shape Europe's destiny for centuries. But perhaps the greatest lesson of this era was that war was no longer just about swords and muskets. It was about ideas. Napoleon carried the ideas of the French Revolution with him, spreading them across Europe. Bolivar carried the idea of freedom. Even Suleiman carried the idea of empire as justice, as order. The battlefield had become a stage not just for power, but for visions that could outlive the men who dreamed them. As the smoke of muskets filled the air, as cannons roared, as ships clashed on distant seas, leadership itself was being tested. Some leaders rose to glory, others fell into ruin, but all left their mark on the age of empires. And as the modern world approached, wars would become even greater, more devastating, fought with machines of destruction never seen before. The early modern age gave us Napoleon, Nelson, Suleiman, Bolivar, Frederick, and countless others whose names still echo. But the next era would give us something even more. It would give us world wars, battles that spanned continents, leaders who commanded not thousands but millions, wars where the very survival of humanity seemed at stake. The age of conquerors was fading, and the age of total war was about to begin. The dawn of the modern age brought with it a darkness the world had never seen before. The scale of war grew beyond imagination. No longer were battles fought only with swords, cavalry, and cannons. Now entire nations became armies, factories became weapons, and millions marched into the fire. Leadership was no longer just about strategy. It was about holding together the spirit of nations when everything seemed lost. In the late 18th century, across the Atlantic Ocean, a man named George Washington led a people who dared to challenge an empire. The American colonies had risen against Britain, the most powerful nation of its time. Washington was not the most experienced general, nor was he always victorious. In fact, he lost many battles. But his strength was never in perfection. It was in perseverance. He kept his army alive when defeat seemed certain, retreating when needed, striking when the chance was right, and above all, never surrendering. Through icy winters, starvation, and despair, Washington stood as a symbol of hope. His soldiers followed him not because he was invincible, but because he refused to break. When the British finally laid down their arms at Yorktown, the world witnessed the birth of a new nation. Washington had shown that leadership was not about never falling, but about always rising again. He would go on to become the first president of the United States, but his greatest legacy was proving that freedom could be won with courage, patience, and faith. As the world entered the 19th and 20th centuries, revolutions spread like wildfire, and empires clashed across continents, but nothing could prepare humanity for the storms of the world wars. These were not battles of kings or generals alone. They were struggles that consumed the globe. And in this chaos, new leaders emerged, leaders who would carry nations on their shoulders through the darkest nights. In the First World War, Generals like Ferdinand Foch of France and Douglas Haig of Britain commanded millions, while on the other side, Germany's Erich Ludendorff pushed offensives with relentless force. The war was a slaughterhouse, trenches stretching for miles, machines of death grinding soldiers into dust. Leadership was tested not just in victories, but in endurance, in the ability to keep broken armies from collapsing entirely. The Great War ended, but its scars never healed, and from those scars rose an even greater storm. World War II became the greatest test of leadership in human history. On one side stood leaders like Winston Churchill, who rallied Britain with words as powerful as any weapon. When bombs rained on London and invasion loomed, Churchill's voice thundered through the radios. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight in the fields. We shall never surrender." His speeches were not mere words, they were shields of iron that kept the British people standing tall when the night seemed endless. In America, General Dwight D. Eisenhower took on the impossible task of uniting armies from different nations, with different languages, strategies, and egos, into one force. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, he planned the greatest invasion in history. D-Day on June 6, 1944, under stormy skies and against fortress-like defenses, hundreds of thousands stormed the beaches of Normandy. The success of that day was not just in strategy, but in Eisenhower's ability to unite men, to give them one vision, one purpose. That day turned the tide of the war. Across the deserts of North Africa, the German general Erwin Rommel became a legend, called the Desert Fox. His tactics were daring, his movements swift, his leadership charismatic. His enemies respected him even as they fought him, for he embodied the code of a soldier. Rommel's brilliance delayed defeat for Germany, but even he could not escape the crushing weight of a world united against tyranny. And then there was the East, where the Soviet commander Georgy Zhukov turned the tide at Stalingrad. In frozen ruins, amid starvation and endless waves of battle, Zhukov's leadership rallied Soviet forces to resist the unstoppable machine of the German Wehrmacht. Against all odds, they did not just survive, they counterattacked, encircling the German Sixth Army and dealing Hitler his first devastating defeat. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a turning point in history. The war ended with cities in ruins, tens of millions dead, and a world forever changed. Leadership in those years was not about glory, it was about survival, endurance, and the will to fight when surrender seemed easier. Churchill, Eisenhower, Rommel, Zhukov each showed that even in the darkest times, the spark of leadership can guide nations through fire. But the 20th century did not end with World War II, wars continued. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Africa, in the Middle East. Leaders like Vo Nguyen Giap of Vietnam showed the world how determination could overcome overwhelming power. Facing the mighty United States, Giap used guerrilla tactics, patience, and the will of his people to wear down a superpower. He proved that victory was not always about technology or size, it was about outlasting the storm. In the Middle East, leaders like Anwar Sadat of Egypt commanded armies in wars that shook the region. While in Israel, commanders like Moshe Dayan defended their nation with boldness and innovation. Across the world, military leaders rose not just in great powers, but in small nations, each shaping their people's destiny through courage and vision. The modern age has also given us leaders who understood that sometimes the greatest victory is avoiding war altogether. Men like Charles de Gaulle, who rebuilt France after the devastation, or Dwight Eisenhower himself, who as president warned of the dangers of endless militarism, reminding the world that leadership is not only about leading into battle, but about leading away from it when peace is possible. From Washington to Eisenhower, from Churchill to Giap, the modern age has proven that war is no longer just the clash of armies, it is the clash of nations, of ideologies, of entire worlds. And yet, in every conflict, one truth remains the same. It is leadership that makes the difference. One man or woman at the front, carrying the burden of millions, deciding whether their people will stand or fall. Think back to the names we have traveled through. Alexander the Great, never losing a battle, carving empires before his 33rd year. Julius Caesar, turning Rome into an empire with courage and ambition. Hannibal, crossing mountains with elephants to strike fear into the heart of Rome. Khalid ibn al-Walid, undefeated, the sword of God. Saladin, the warrior of mercy, reclaiming Jerusalem with honor. Genghis Khan, the storm who united tribes and shook the world. Napoleon, the lightning of Europe, rewriting strategy itself. Nelson, the master of the seas. Suleiman, the magnificent sultan of empire. Washington, the father of a nation. Eisenhower, the man who led the world's greatest invasion. Churchill, whose words were stronger than bombs. Rommel, the desert fox. Zhukov, the defender of Stalingrad. Giap, the strategist of patience. Different lands, different centuries, different battles, but one thing unites them all: the power of leadership. It is not always about victory. Some won everything, some lost in the end, but each left behind a mark, a lesson, a story that echoes through time. They showed that leadership is not simply commanding soldiers, it is vision, it is courage, it is the ability to inspire men to fight when fear is stronger than steel. And so, As history continues, as wars rise and fall, as nations clash and peace is forged, one truth remains: weapons may change, technology may advance, but the power of leadership will always decide the fate of battles. Empires crumble, flags change, but the names of great leaders never die. They live in every strategy taught, every battle remembered, every soldier inspired. They are proof that one mind, one heart, one leader can change the course of history forever.